Hi. So I am doing my paper on combating deforestation in Brazil, and I wanted to focus on some of the issues that are taking place there, as well as how to properly address deforestation. So I'm going to look at originally what the causes of deforestation are, what the issues are, why this is so important, and what has been done about it, what is being done about it now, and what my policy recommendations are, as this is a policy brief. I hope you enjoy the presentation, and please let me know if there are any suggestions or comments that you have based on the presentation. So a Brazilian background in deforestation, it's important to realize that deforestation is not a unique issue to Brazil. Deforestation happens in Malaysia, Indonesia, in the Congo forest. That's not something that only happens in Brazil. However, when talking about Brazil, it's important to realize that this problem is pretty blown up and exacerbated because of the fact that Brazil houses 20% of the world's fresh water. And it absorbs about 2.2 billion tons of CO2 a year, considering the vast expanses of forest that are within the Amazon. Since 1988, more than 153,000 square miles of Amazonian rainforest has been cleared in Brazil. That number has not declined, obviously. However, the pace of the increase of that number has declined, and I'll discuss that moving forward. The response to deforestation, especially within Brazil, has ranged from outright denial of the impact of that deforestation has on climate change. This denial was really up until 2004 with President Lula's administration, um, where that administration began cooperating with the UN and the convention and the various conventions on climate change and began looking at an alternative to deforestation. But then we see a little bit of a reversal following that in 2012, 2014 with President Dilma's administration, where we see a little bit of a lax on this. So we've seen both extremes and somewhere closer to the middle on this issue. As far as clearing of the forest is often done for logging, mining, infrastructure, cattle grazing, farming, hydraulics, hydro mining. Um, you are looking at also expanding farmland, mining for various minerals, and as these are just the legal means of clearing the forest. There's also illegal burning of the forest, illegal logging of the forest, and legal grazing that goes on. So the major drivers for deforestation, much of deforestation is economically driven. There's an incentive to deforest. There's a value to it. In the 1970s and 1980s, that value included tax incentives by the Brazilian government for industries such as farming and soybean farms and cattle grazing and the beef industry. So it was very incentive. There was numerous incentives to cut down the forest and build on that land because they ended up with getting tax credits from the government. Those tax credits ended in 1991. However, the giving of new tax credits ended in 1991. However, the old incentives from the 70s and 80s continued for people that existed and had them. Um, One of the drivers is also the value of products such as soybeans, beef, and wood. As the value of those products fluctuates, so does the rate of deforestation. When we saw the value of soybeans go up in the mid 1990s, we saw an uptick in deforestation. At times of economic prosperity, we would see increased of deforestation. However, during times of economic downturns in Brazil during the 1992, 1993, we saw a decrease in deforestation just because of the downturn and the poor economy. So that also plays a major role. And lastly, cattle ranching and farming for a growing population, not just the Brazilian population, but a growing worldwide population, as the beef industry is a major driver behind this. So, what exactly is the problem? So, yes, there are economic incentives for deforestation, but there are also issues associated with it. Deforestation has a major negative impact on the environment. That's something that anyone could take a guess. But what are those effects? So one is lost watershed functions, which causes the decrease in the percentage of recycled water. This actually causes 30% less, 20 to 30% less of recycled water to take place, especially from higher up in mountains and forests of Brazil. There is a decrease in CO2 absorption, and scientists estimate today that the Amazon absorbs 20 to 30% less CO2 today than it did 30 years ago. And this is just a gradual decline in the amount that the rainforest is able to absorb. Um, if you can look and picture the Amazon rainforest as a giant carbon sink, because that's ultimately what it is. Um, and it soaks up CO2, soaks up carbon dioxide. And what happens is we're reducing the amount of trees that are able to absorb carbon dioxide, but at the same time, we are producing more carbon dioxide. So not only are we decreasing the amount of carbon dioxide that is absorbed, we're also further straining and stressing the existing forest that is there now. And research shows that trees are living shorter now. They're maturing faster and they're dying off sooner. And as they die off, they release CO2 emissions. They release carbon dioxide instead of absorbing it. So that's another problem that is caused by deforesting the Amazon. And it's important to note that deforestation alone contributes 10 to 15% of CO2 emissions. That is more than all cars combined. That's sometimes something that's easily overlooked because of the fact that this is not necessarily happening here at home. So turning to President Lula's administration, what has been done in Brazil? So President Lula in 2004 began ushering a new era of cooperation with the UNFCCC. He created the Amazon Forest Fund, which is a voluntary fund to basically ask countries to voluntarily contribute money in order for Brazil to start projects within its own lands in order to help protect the forest and to work with local communities. Um, the only country that decided to take Brazil on its offer was Norway, which contributed $1 billion over a number of years, and money would be based on progress. Um, Also, the Lula administration began negotiating Red and Red D plus based on what works for Brazil, what projects would work for Brazil, how would that be negotiated on the broader scheme post Kyoto, post Copenhagen. Um, what the administration also did is they created large areas, large protected areas of the Amazon, and today um, almost 53% of the Amazon rain of Brazil's legal Amazon rainforest is now protected. A lot of these protected areas also served as barriers towards even more delicate and more sensitive environmental areas. Um, The administration also increased fines, monitoring, and the implementation of anti-deforestation laws. A lot of these laws were already in place in the late 1990s and early 2000s. However, they weren't really enforced, and the Lula administration began enforcing such laws. The result is significant. This resulted in a decrease of 83.5% in deforestation by 2012, down from the 2004 peak. So this worked in reducing deforestation. So looking briefly at the Amazon Fund and Red Plus, both were set up as economic incentives to decrease deforestation. They are basically focused on creating projects within local communities in order to aid them in both protecting the forest and compensating them for that, for protecting the forest, in order for them not to turn to avenues in which they would have to deforest in order to generate funds. Um, However, there are problems with these. Both of these are voluntary, and there is no enforcement mechanism. Um, as a result, there is no predictable or consistent funding base, which makes it very difficult, especially for a local community that may be relying on those funds, that may have relied in the past on deforestation as a means to generate a living. Having programs in place is great, but if they cannot sustain the populations that they need to be able to sustain, they will not be effective. There's also a lack of consensus on international within the international committee, but that is nothing new considering how difficult it is to get to agreements. We saw that in Paris, where we finally got an agreement on a much watered down agreement. So it's very difficult to get consensus on big ticket issues just like this one. One of the other issues that have been brought up was, especially with the Amazon fund, a lot of that money is managed by Brazil. Brazil manages that money. It's given to Brazil, the Brazilian government, and then it's filtered down to local governments, who are then responsible for carrying out the projects with local governments, with local tribes, with local populations, and indigenous populations. However, the issue becomes when we have incompetent local governments or incompetent population leadership, that opens the door for corruption and opens the door for that money to be used for something other than what it's supposed to be used for, which is which is meant to be towards protecting the forest. So some of my policy recommendations for this, as this is a policy brief, include building on the Red Plus mechanism to create an international carbon trading market. Um, this would be a market that is would work basically as a carbon stock market and would become a more stable fixture in carbon trading, carbon tax credit trading, in order to provide a consistent monetary um, base for providing funds in order to protect the forest. Further, the money in Brazil, whether it is through Red Plus or through the Amazon uh, fund, that money must be, or I propose that it would be managed by local NGOs with oversight from the UN and the UNFCCC, um, and that they must work in conjunction with local communities um, in order to combat deforestation. Here, the projects would be managed by NGOs with oversight, as opposed to the Brazilian government itself or the local government. However, local communities must be involved in the process of what the project might look like, where exactly the funding is going to go towards, how to manage that funding, and how to train local communities into towards industries that are going to be environmentally friendly, especially to the forest. And finally, I propose creating mandatory funding quotas set based on the amount of forest that's being preserved. There is some form of that within RED already. However, these would be mandatory funding, and that would go into a pool within the international market, and a certain percentage would be given to Brazil based on the amount of forest that it preserves. And that money would then also go towards the fund given to NGOs to create local projects within Brazil itself. So these are my policy recommendations. That is basically a quick summary of what my paper is. This is my works cited of some of the sources that I used. Feel free to check them out. And let me know if you have any questions or any constructive criticism, things that I could focus on. I would really appreciate it. Thank you.